Yeah, absolutely. And I think that really is at the heart of a lot of my argument. And I think it's a really slippery slope. And a lot of people get very anxious, and maybe rightly so, about when you challenge what we mean by evidence-based medicine and where our evidence comes from, because they feel like if you start challenging that idea, people will lose all kind of faith in kind of medical systems and medical sciences. But actually, for me as a doctor that still practices these guidelines, still treats patients every day, I really believe that if we don't have those conversations, that actually we're just doing everybody a disservice. Like, we have to talk about the fact that a lot of our experiments and our understanding about the body is really just deeply, deeply flawed by who's considered credible and who gets to produce evidence, and where some of that evidence started. Yeah, absolutely. I think more and more people are trying to understand when we talk about race, and particularly conversation around 2020, but people have got more and more comfortable talking about what we mean, I suppose, about race. And I think when we are looking at race as a concept, some of the earliest classification systems came from some of our earliest kind of Enlightenment thinkers. Carl Linnaeus was a botanist, a Swedish botanist, very much looking at plant classifications that then overspilt into humankind and classifications, and he had various iterations of classifying the varieties of mankind. The Linnaeus Society in London have done, if anybody's as fascinated with the history of medicine as I am, have done a huge body of work looking at his own contribution to this area. But what you see is not just a classification system and trying to put people in boxes. It's also that idea that by being in these boxes, you have defined characteristics. So I delve into the specific story in the book of Sarah or Sajiti Bartman, a member of the Khoi tribe that was exhibited as part of like human zoos in London around Europe. And Linnaeus classified that tribe as monstrous. So they were considered this link between human beings and primates. And by doing so and classifying them in this inferior way, it actually kept on carrying through all of science. So you see others build on his ideas, the subjugation of that particular tribe, like then the continued exhibition of individuals from that part of the world around Europe to reiterate that point. So I think also it shows how these ideas can start at this really defined point in time, and you see people, as people do in science, cite each other, it escalates, nobody really looks at like where that original idea came from. And I think it's something that is so fraught because, as I read in that chapter, a lot of you will see that I've used different language, right? And it's something I toyed with so much in the book, and I still talk about like, oh, what language am I trying to speak to? What am I trying to address with that specific sentence? And, I describe myself as Black. And when you say that you're a Black person, or you go and you take a form, we always need to, I think, be conscious of what meaning or what is being inferred from that thing. And the problem is with data collection, particularly within medical medicine and science, people often don't know. Okay, so I'm really lucky, and I lecture and I speak to a lot of scientists and medics, physicians, and you can see them kind of. And there might be some in the audience kind of sit back and go, whoopsie, when I say, when you do your studies, do you actually think about what you mean by these racial categories before, at the start of the study? Or do you do the study and afterwards try to make deductions about these categories later? And it's always that, because you mentioned ethnicity. And I intercalated with anthropology. This is how I ended up quite an integral part of my journey. Ethnicity is supposed to be the study of cultural groups, and that's what bonds people. And then you have race, which is what I talked about, which is this classification system of putting people phenotypically, how you look, into these groups and making these deductions about their characteristics. And when we go and tick these forms, it's an amalgamation of all these things. What is really clear, and we saw this not just COVID, but we see when we always talk about the health system and health inequalities, is that there's this idea that bad things have happened and bad things have been done by professionals in the past, but there's always like people can't quite name things. And I saw that a lot. Like people would be like, oh, well, these trials happened and doctors gave these drugs that we hadn't quite tested properly, but like they can't name the studies and they can't name where it happened. And I felt like I needed to give a few examples to give people concrete things. And also I often see people twist the examples, right? So it gets worse, or sometimes it's just not quite accurate. So I thought that was really important. But in saying that, I think we only have, even in this book, every single day when I go and I talk to different groups, I'm lucky enough to go to different universities, I keep on finding out more and more things that are just so terrible. And we only have the tip of the iceberg. So I'll give an example. Lots of you might know about the Hunterian Museum, which is a medical surgical museum in London, but there's also a collection in Glasgow. I was in lecture in Glasgow recently, and the people that look after the collection, you know, they don't know sometimes what to do with some of the things, or the things they find. Essentially, they'll be like, well, we found, you know, this fetus that belongs to like an Aborigine group. Like, we don't know quite how it got here, but like we just have this jar of this fetus, you know. And it sounds really awful, but people just finding these like human remains in these collections that somebody took, usually through some awful means. Sometimes they were removed from people. And I just think we really got the tip of the iceberg. And I think to deal with the distrust that different groups have, and we have to remember that, you know, each community has their own stories to tell, but often there's this idea that bad things have been done and we don't really trust medical professionals in this area or whatever. I do think there needs to be like some kind of level of reckoning that like we don't know when these things exist, instead of just like hiding them.